So in the last episode, we talked about how much was unfamiliar to the person that didn't make the playlist. And I knew 50% of this at the gates exclusively because of you.
Yeah.
Because you were like, this is one of the best metal records of all time. And Disfear out of the 6 Degrees of Converge. One of my favorite Converge orbit projects is Doom Riders, Nate Newton's like biker band, and they did a split with Disfear. And as a result of that, I got really into D-Beat, like a really specific kind of offshoot of this thing. It's basically like if you took Motorhead and like pumped it full of meth, which makes it sound terrible, but it's super rad.
No, I'm into it.
But the quiet MVP of this thing for me is this Bloodbath song and the band Bloodbath. I like less and less all the time now. I'm finding myself like actively seeking out metal for metal's sake type bands, and I don't ever know how to make the distinction of like this is a tight heavy band versus this is a band trying to be a metal band. But the occasional thing, because of that, like a Bloodbath will get past me. And I was listening to the playlist after you put it together, and I had my holy shit in the grocery store moment with headphones where I was like, this is the best new, and I listened to it 10 times in a row. But, you know, I think this is, it would be easy for me to say some of the later stuff is my favorite, but because this little combo of things sounds so good and was so new to me, I think this wound up being my favorite of the playlist, where this is like really kind of the tipping point where it starts to, they really start dialing it in, so to speak.
Oh, yeah. And this is probably 4 of the kind of weirdest or almost most disparate, especially of
and I think that's what I like about it.
Yeah, because it starts to explore, like I titled this section in the outline, what if we also produce the music, though? Like, because, you know, we talked about that.
There was one time there was a band called The Showdown, a metal band, and their first record, there was.
Yes, Nate.
Arguably, yeah. But I will never forget, like, there are these minuscule musical moments that I don't know why they stick with me, but they do. But I remember you giving me that record and being like, it's an amazing metal record, despite the fact that it sounds like they recorded it in the back of a moving car. And I've never forgotten that descriptor. And Block 1 has a little bit of that. Why did they record it in a station wagon? Or a station wagon inside of a barn. And then this is like, okay, that's stupid. Like, let's like make it sound good, guys.
Yeah.
So this section is a relief to me.
So just to read out the 4 of Darksome Origin from Edge of Sanity, which came out in '94. Blinded by Fear from At the Gates came out in '95. And then we'll jump forward a little bit to the Disfear song Live the Storm from 2008, and then the Bloodbath record you mentioned came out in 2005. I picked Eaton off of it for some specific reasons, but like now I really want to double down. If there's one human being on earth who's willing to like listen really specifically to these songs and hear what we're talking about, I want to tell you what to listen for because these rule. The Edge of Sanity song, they started to get to where they could produce the articulation and use noise gating or whatever else to give it a quick, unsustained stop. And like Edge of Sanity will stop mid-song and go in a totally different direction, right? So they'll just like shift into a different riff, and it's sharp with the HM-2 guitar tone in a way that other metal distortion doesn't really do, because the articulation on the very earliest part of the note is sort of what starts breaking the HM-2 into its own category, and so you can really hear it here on this particular song from Edge of Sanity, and then like around 3 minutes and 30 seconds into it, they start building up into this perfect riff. But like, again, just a great example of like production and musicality starting to improve around each other. Because that first block of bands we talked about, I mean, they sort of prided themselves on not being good on purpose. It was a culture, and like this is a
like the Ramones for murderers.
Yeah. Murderers and pacifists are the only thing that make up that part of the world. And then we get to At the Gates, and like Slaughter of the Soul is just like at least a top 10 heavy music record ever.
We talked about Illmatic on the previous episode, and I think they're kind of from around the same time period, where it's like there was nothing like it before it, and there's been nothing really truly like it since.
Yeah.
It just came so out of nowhere. It's also the only record where they use the papyrus font on the cover that I would ever recommend to any human being alive. But good God, is that a tight record.
Oh,
and you have two things. You have the tone, right? And you have the thing that they do with the HM-2. Also played through a PV solid state amp. I just can't emphasize enough how shitty a PV is. But, you know, they are what would be described, and I hate getting into genre descriptors like this. I actively resist them at every turn, but what would be described as melodic death metal.
Yeah.
Because, I appreciate that genre term because it's the best way to describe what they do from a guitar songwriting perspective.
Yeah.
Like, they do the kinds of riffs and leads that you find yourself humming and singing, and not in like a Beatlesy way. That it's so tough, and it's also so memorable because of these guitar lines. It has that edge, but it also has the kind of melodic core. It's so singular to them and their sensibilities, right? Dude. Oh.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And like that's what I wanted to call out too, is like because At the Gates took it in a relatively more melodic direction. Again, it's starting to bring out, like, it's starting to break with the original meme of the pedal. The thing that they're keeping is including it with these really weird buzzsaw settings, but what they're learning to do is put it into different contexts where it actually fills the rest of it out. This is also the first block where, and then you'll see this as we go into a section of exclusively Kurt Ballou produced songs. But the thing you need to start to see here is that they started to figure out how to mix the vocals. Vocal and guitar mixture in metal is just awful to this day.
Yeah. And it's make or break.
Yeah. Like 70% of metal records are just like mixed awfully, right? And
to the point that you listen to most vocalists and you're like, I'm sure you're probably friends with these great musicians, but why are you in this band?
Yep.
God.
Yep. It's a waste.
It's a deal breaker so much of the time.
Totally. So Blinded by Fear is a perfect example of that starting to work its way out the right way to where everything sounds in balance. Now, the Disfear song, Live the Storm, that actually is a Kurt Ballou produced one too, that whole record. And that, you know, as you mentioned, that's the vocalist from At the Gates, and that's a guitarist from Entombed. So now we're kind of like doing this like, okay, we're going to take two like godfathers of a tiny genre of music already and then like shove them together into the tiniest form of a super group that's ever existed.
And it's not quite what you would expect from that on paper, which is so great.
Yeah, they would call themselves crust punk, strangely enough. You know, it sounds enough like the songs that come before it for you to hear the lineage pretty clearly. But yeah, like starting to branch out and using, again, you have to be in this context to appreciate the differences between the genres, but these people definitely did. So this was new territory to be using the guitar in this, or the HM-2 in that context. And then I wanted to bring in Bloodbath because I also wanted to bring in the other side of like, this is the most death metal-y of all the death metal type songs on this list at all. Because the Swedish death metal thing would kind of continue to be groove oriented perpetually. And I think that's probably because At the Gates gave it that melodic tinge and it became so popular. Bloodbath is like, no, we're over here in like immolation territory, right? Just like lots of double bass and real slow guitar riffs and real deep vocals. But another good example of the vocals perfectly aligning with the production of everything else to where this is just like dark, blackened death metal. but using the buzzsaw sound to really fill it out. And this is where it really starts to, like you've mentioned, occupy like a lower end of the registry, like as a unit. Like the whole band kind of feels like they got pitch shifted down. But it's also worth calling out this song because once you get into Bloodbath and further territory, you start running out of songs that like feel good to talk about because they're just like rough. And like this one is a lighter example, and it's still about the true story of a kid who was obsessed with being eaten alive and he paid somebody else to do it. And so the story is told from that perspective. Probably the only song you'll listen to in 2020 that has the lyrics "suck my guts and lick my heart," which the first time you hear it, guts and heart are not the words that pop to your mind when you're listening to it anyway. So that'll be fun. Go back and listen to that and try to figure out what you're pulling out.
You made this point in the sampling one where with the Flo and Eddie where like you weren't really listening and then you had to like, well, hold on, let's run that back. With guttural vocals, it's usually like hard to know. The music is the entree with a lot of this stuff, right? And then the lyrics are window dressing. It's just to like almost set an aesthetic almost. But you can clearly hear in the chorus where he's like, my one desire, my only wish is to be eaten.
It is so good.
And that's not like normally so much metal is about being in the position of power and command and exerting the violence that I was like, hold on, did he say what I think he said? And then you go back in the first verses, I've had one desire since I was born, to see my body ripped and torn, to see my flesh devoured before my eyes. Only for you I volunteer as a human sacrifice. It's just so counter to most metal aesthetic, but it makes it that much more brutal. Like this song, this is the Flo and Eddie song of this playlist. It's bonkers. Yeah. It's absolutely bonkers.
I love that you brought that out though, because like when people will give me the actual chance to be like, no, give me 120 seconds to defend metal, okay? Like this is where I go pretty quickly because like what people see is the violence of it, and there's a ton of it. And a ton of it is unacceptable, okay? And like
there's so much toxic masculinity and bad and all that. But if you can push through that, the good examples are so good.
Yeah, and like, but like, violence is I've described it as like violence is a motif that a lot of metal bands use, and they're borrowing the terms and the ideas and all that. And it may not sound like art to you, and that's fine. Like you don't have to love it. I think On the Nose rap is misogynistic and it annoys me. But like it's a different style of art form, and this one is a good example of like when someone does push real directly into the violence direction, the production supports it. This would not work unless the music itself frightened you the right way. So move your way through these 4 songs, kind of listen to the way that the production of the HM-2 gets shaped directionally. And then Bloodbath is the key one to end on because we're going to pick back up with what I think is, in my opinion at least, a more modern iteration of that style of music.